The gospel for the Ascension actually tells us nothing about the Ascension. Other scripture passages, such as Acts chapter 1, verses 1 to 11, Mark 16, verse 19, or Luke 24, the account of Cleopas and presumably his wife, who meet Jesus on the road to Emmaus, but do not recognize him at first, but do after they talk about their meeting with this stranger. And he appears and opens their minds as he accompanies them as far as Bethany, where Jesus blesses them. And Luke, in chapter 24, verse 50, says he withdraws from them and was carried up into heaven. And they worshiped him, though some sources omit that word, worship. And they returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and they were continually in the temple blessing God. The Gospel of John also lacks an actual ascension, but in his last discourses, he promises to be with the disciples after he dies, and he will send them an advocate, a comforter, an encourager. In Acts chapter 1, verses 3 to 11, Luke's second part to his gospel, in the midst of telling them that the Holy Spirit will come and they will be his witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth, we read, when he has said this, as they were watching, he was lifted up. A cloud took him out of their sight. When he was going and they were gazing upward toward heaven, suddenly two men in white robes stood by them. They said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up toward heaven? This Jesus who has been taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go." They returned to Jerusalem to the upper room with the 11 who are named, and certain women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. Now, to return to the passage that I read a few minutes ago, the passage assigned for the Feast of the Ascension in the lectionary, Matthew chapter 28, verses 16 to 20, I asked myself, well, wait a minute, what is missing here? We have some elements, but no mention of his being taken up into heaven. And what are some of those same elements? Well, we have the 11. But nothing is said about restoring the number to 12, that messianic symbol that the gospel writers use to describe the special group of Jesus's apostles. And yet, going back a little bit before this passage that has been assigned for today's feast, we read about the direction given to the 11 to come to Galilee, to the mountain. An angel who had rolled back the stone for Mary Magdalene and the other Mary tells them to go and tell the other disciples. The passage says, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. Then, while the women are going, suddenly Jesus meets them and greets them. And they come to him, take hold of his feet, and worshiped him. The Greek word there for worship, prosokineson, which means an act of homage, such as kneeling. Jesus then delivers the same message that the angel had delivered: go to Galilee. This prepares us for the climactic appearance we have in today's lectionary reading, for the Ascension. The late Dan Harrington, S.J., who was a friend of mine and whose commentary I'm following, notes that Galilee is where Matthew's community and Matthew's opponents were located. The mention of Galilee twice at the end of Matthew's gospel adds to the reader's interest, something like when you have a mention of your hometown in a book you are reading, or perhaps a motion picture that you might make an extra effort to see because it mentions your hometown. The setting that we have in this passage, although no particular mountain is mentioned, is similar to the one in Matthew chapter 17, where Jesus leads Peter, James, and John up to the mountain where he's transfigured, glorified by the voice of God. Unlike Mark's account, where there are several appearances of the risen Jesus before his ascension, in Matthew, this is the first appearance to the 11. The first appearance in Galilee, that is. The risen Jesus in Matthew only appears to the women at the tomb, to Mary Magdalene and the other Mary in Matthew's gospel. So now we are in the graduation season at my college and at many universities in the state of Massachusetts and other places throughout the country. And so I couldn't help thinking about this when the commentation on the workbook for lectors, which is where I read my passage, mentions that this passage has a valedictory quality to it. In fact, I was thinking about that because in my role as a teacher, a theology teacher, I stress that the Paschal Mystery is not just a liturgical year celebration, but the dynamic of the Christian life. It is the dynamic of an enacted discipleship which penetrates our lives. Now, as students often do when preparing for tests, they create mnemonic memory devices to instigate their memory. And I encourage this practice. And so in talking about the Paschal Mystery, they write down for themselves in their notes, the PDRA, the Passion, Death, Resurrection, and Ascension. Now, it's not hard to see that the two elements of death and resurrection are at the heart of the Paschal Mystery and a frequent occurrence in one's daily life. But what about the Passion? And certainly in terms of today's feast, what about the Ascension? As Sister Colette said at the very beginning, both of those dimensions entail hope, especially and particularly with the Ascension, which is not merely a victory, but is often the element shrouded in mystery in our lives because it is so future-oriented. I just lost my place in my notes. Excuse me for just a minute. So back to talking about the passage that we have in Matthew 28, which is often called the Great Commission. Jesus approaches the disciples, and we note that on seeing him, this is not just another appearance, but what's interesting is that usually it's other people who approach Jesus. And so here Jesus is approaching the disciples. Whoops. I think that this Feast of the Ascension, just as a little bit of a break here, whether it was this past Thursday for some of us, or whether it's being transferred to tomorrow, to Sunday, we can see that it is really the conclusion, not just the conclusion to the Easter story, but the whole story of Matthew's gospel, which he tells really as one story. There is a strong continuity of the events of the Easter story, which he tells us in 4 scenes. First, the encounter of the women at the empty tomb in verses 1-7 of chapter 28. Second, their brief encounter, which I already read in verses 8-10 with the risen Jesus on their way to carry out the angel's command to tell the other disciples. Third, which isn't mentioned in this passage, the Jewish leaders' attempt to suppress the story by circulating the idea that the disciples took the body from the tomb. And finally, concluding his final appearance in this passage that we hear in Matthew 28, 16-20. This scene is the high point of the Easter story for Matthew's community. It's the goal of his main story has been heading to from the very beginning of the gospel. Brendan Byrne, in the Paulist Biblical Commentary, notes that the return to Galilee is no mere return to congenial haunts. Jesus had withdrawn to Galilee after hearing of John the Baptist's arrest, which fulfilled the Isaiah prophecy of the Galilees of the Gentiles. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. And Matthew repeats this when he talks about Galilee representing the Gentile world as a whole. As I mentioned, no particular mountain is named. However, on this unnamed mountain in Galilee, he communicates a commission to his disciples or learners to take this instruction to the nations, which echoes also Israel's role to be the light of the nations that we hear about at least 3 or 4 times in the prophet Isaiah. It is interesting that the one the disciples encounter in this passage bears no exalted titles. He is simply Jesus. Nonetheless, they fall down in worship before him. And as I mentioned, this word is used several other times in the gospel when Jesus causes the winds to cease and calms the waves, reaching out to grasp Peter's hand, who tried to walk on the water. But some, we are told, doubted. That word distazo, or distazo, which also recalls Peter in the boat, who said, "If it is your command to come, for me to come to you on the water, come." But it could also indicate some guilt, perhaps, this notion of doubt or hesitation on the part of the disciples for their desertion of Jesus at the time of the crucifixion. We do not know. However, the scene acknowledges the persistence of weakness in the community, and it should encourage us, because that it is in this same mixed state of belief that Jesus approaches us in this gospel for the Ascension. This is unusual, since mostly, again, it is people who approach Jesus during his ministry. But despite the hesitation, he gives them and us this great commission. Jesus claims that for himself, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him. And he appeals to this authority by implicitly referring to the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, chapter 7. He refers to the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven in that gospel, in that book. So what we have here is a praxis. The disciples are commanded to do 4 things. First, to go out. Secondly, to make disciples of the nations. Third, to baptize. And fourth, to teach. Other commentaries cite simply that this commission has 2 parts. The first part is the appearance proper, and the second part is this declaration, which itself has 3 parts. First, the self-revelation of Jesus's power and authority. Secondly, the missionary charge. And third, the promise to be present with us until the end of time. This climactic appearance is only found in Matthew's gospel. The various uses of the Son of Man title, for example, often meant in either a generic way or comprising the notion of death and resurrection, or as an apocalyptic title. This is often understood simply, the Son of Man, that is, as a human being. And it is joined by being given divine authority here in this passage. The Son of God directs that Gentiles be baptized in his name. And it is Emmanuel who promises to be with his followers until the end of the present age. In this passage, we find that the meaning of discipleship in Matthew's gospel has reached a maturity, or maybe we could call it a ripeness. In receiving a commission to seek out new members, this meant for Matthew's community to open their community to non-Jews. And rather than an explicit proselytizing, one might interpret the method of making disciples as involving living the good news of the reign of God in such a way that our lives become a living gospel, which is to be freely accepted and undergone as a new baptism, a Trinitarian baptism compared to the baptism of John. One of these lessons, precisely for us who live in this new age, is to ponder, what does this baptism mean? We have been baptized in our own Trinitarian form, but as Vatican II made clear, by our baptism, we have also been made participants in the priestly, prophetic, and kingly role of Jesus. As Pope Francis has said, or I should say has seen, Vatican II left open what it means to be the church as the people of God. What does it mean to take this most fundamental self-understanding of what it means to be church? With the coming of synodality, particularly in the upcoming synod, all of us are called to renew our baptismal equality. By entering into this fundamental way of understanding ourselves as church, we are participating in what Jesus' ascension has fundamentally meant. We are participating in the glory of being seated at the right hand of the Father. And we look forward to his coming in glory, to judge the living, as we look forward to his coming in glory, to judge the living and the dead, and the reign of God, which will have no end. May we strive to live out our story in such a way that it too will become a living gospel and attract many. Thank you.